The Juneau World Affairs Council presents Revisiting Human Rights in Guatemala in the Aftermath of the Civil War with Maria Offer. Offer is an education consultant who specializes in reading and curriculum. She volunteered in the 1980s in Guatemala during its decades-long civil war. She's still involved in the country and is setting up an education program there for rural Indigenous children.
Thank you all for coming. I'm really happy to be here, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some of my experiences with you, and I'm also looking forward to your questions. Thank you, Jim Clark, for the introduction, and I'm just really glad to be part of the community, contributing to the community, and sharing at this time with you today. It's really great being part of Juneau and the size of community we have, that a lot of us know each other, and this is my third talk I've given for Juneau World Affairs Council, so I'm able to share some of my experiences in doing literacy work, volunteer work, and just really, it's broadened my worldview, and I hope to help broaden your worldview and understanding of some of the issues. So I just feel like, being part of the community has always been really important for me, and being part of Juneau World Affairs Council. Jim Clark, for example, I've been teaching Spanish, and I've taught Spanish to his grandchild, and so it's really fun to contribute in many ways. And in this talk, I'm going to be talking about how using Spanish or another language has really broadened my life and my worldview. So our topic is on human rights in Guatemala. A lot of things have been happening over the past few decades and recently in Guatemala. So just to highlight some of the topics I'm going to talk about is the recent civil war or genocide, and accountability for past atrocities, public security, which is some of the questions I got asked a lot about public security, the criminal justice system, use of military and public security operation, child labor and exploitation, gender-based violence, and also attacks on human rights defenders, trade unionists, journalists, etc. There's a lot of international awareness for the situation of human rights. The one I just mentioned about attacks on human rights defenders, it was just brought up prior to this meeting. Somebody knew somebody who was doing great work in Guatemala, but then had to leave. So all of these are really important topics. Okay, so some people ask me, why Guatemala? Like, what brought you to Guatemala? And it goes back pretty far. I was studying for my bachelor's of history at Northern Michigan University. I was studying third world development, focused on human rights, and also developing nations and villages. I was really attracted. I had a course just on villages in the third world. And I was also a member of our ski team and running team, so I was into distance running, outdoor sports, obviously. And a little interesting connection with Juneau is the year I was on, that I joined the cross-country ski team, or Nordic ski team, the year prior, Guy Thibodeau was the coach there at Northern Michigan University. And one of my teammates who was on when Guy was a coach, it's his brother who lives in Guatemala, and I was going down to visit. So there's even another connection with Guatemala and in my life and here in Alaska. So when I was in college, I went to see a slideshow, much like this one, and a doctor was coming back from her work with Doctors Without Borders. She was in Central America, and I was just really blown away by the images on the slides. I was also really taken in by the beauty of the children and their eyes, and yet really shocked by the experiences that they lived through. So from that day, I decided I would learn Spanish, so I would broaden my worldview and really understand what was going on, and which I did. And to this day, I went on and got a master's of Spanish and use it in my volunteer work. So that's what brought me there. I went down to visit her. She was working with Guatemalan refugees. That was in the 80s. I knew very little Spanish, but somehow I got there. So learned as I went, and now I'm very fluent in both writing and speaking. So the very same year, 1983, I came up to Alaska. And I started fishing. There's a picture of me on just in a skiff, subsistence fishing, on a nice day in Kodiak. And then years later, so I'd like work on the fishing boats for 6 months and then go down and do volunteer work in Guatemala. And as I was going, I was becoming very fluent in Spanish. And so I worked at an orphanage. You can see about the age I was here in the 80s. I was working at an orphanage. And then in January, I went back and visited that same area of Guatemala. It's by the Rio Dulce and Lago Izabal. And then I continued my work. I did literacy work, donating children's books in Spanish. I would love to be able to do that in their indigenous languages as well. In Peru, Mexico, I've also taught yoga in Haiti and to indigenous kids in Mexico. So there's a picture of some of the children's artwork. And it's really fun because these children don't have toys, they don't have a lot of joy in their life, they don't have art in the school. And so just to have a workshop where children are able to have joy and express themselves is very important, especially a lot of these children have suffered trauma. So here's a picture of a map of Guatemala, and you can see some people, just to remind ourselves where it is, between this state here is Chiapas. So we're between southern Mexico, Belize on the east, and Honduras and El Salvador to the south, both small Caribbean coast and then the Pacific coast. And this area here between Belize and Chiapas is called the Petén. And Petén, I'm going to talk later about this in my talk. A lot of people know this is where Tikal is. Tikal is by this lake here. I did go up to that area on this trip. And then I'm also going to be talking about this area here, which is called the Ixcan, is there. And they also, you'll see it in some of the slides as far as the location mentioned is the Sierra. And so when the Civil War was going on, people would leave this densely mountainous area and then go up into the villages to hide out from their attackers, from the army. And so that we're going to see the very end of this slideshow. I traveled into those areas that they've now have communities developed, but during the 80s they weren't hiding. And I'd like to mention too at this time, there are some graphic pictures in the slides. Jonathan Muller, who's a famous photographer, gave me permission to use his pictures in the slideshow. And there's some graphic pictures of some of the atrocities of the war. And so just, to be aware that you'll be seeing that and be prepared for that. It might be something you want to, talk about after. And also, I do finish up the slideshow with positive things people are doing in the country for human rights, and some of the things that I'm working on there and the wonderful people I met. So it's a very wonderful country to be in, and it's a lot of valuable work that's going on. Any questions before I get started here?
Maria, could you point out where Guatemala City is in relation to?
Oh, yes, sure. So Guatemala City is in this area right here. And we'll see in the statistics, it's a very large city. I flew into Guatemala City this time. And then Lake Atitlan is another area that I'll be talking about. Most of the people, when they think of Guatemala, they want to coming into Guatemala. And then not far, about 40 minutes away from Guatemala City is Antigua, a city where a lot of people go and study Spanish. A beautiful colonial city, just incredible architecture, so it is a nice city to go to. And then Lake Atitlan is a couple hours away from there. Here's Lago Izabal, where the orphanage is, where I was, and there's connected by the Rio Dulce, which connects to the Caribbean. So a lot of cruisers in the Caribbean, they winter their sailboats are in that area. You might have seen, I was on a bridge that was going over this river when the picture was taken, and there's a lot of sailboats in that area. So, yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, I had wanted to point out Guatemala City and also Lake Atitlan, very famous. And you can see quite the distance from Guatemala City to Tikal. Many people fly when they go there. Okay, so just again to begin with some statistics so we can understand what's going on in the country now. The population is 13 million. The growth rate is 2%. And life expectancy, 70 years. And the capital is Guatemala City. If you ever hear people talking about Guate, it's the capital. When they say that, it's a short for the capital, not just the country. And the population of Guatemala City it's the second largest city in Central America, but if you include the whole metropolitan area, it's the first. So it's really densely populated. Managua, as far as just within the city limits, Managua is the first largest city in Central America, which is pretty amazing too because it was hit by a devastated earthquake. I was also in that area after the earthquake in the 80s. So there's over 4 million people in the metropolitan area. Okay, literacy rates. And this is what really surprises me, and I feel very committed to helping. In Guatemala, literacy rates is 69%, and it's higher for males than it is for females. There's a migration rate. Many people are still leaving Guatemala for economic reasons. And there's just a lot of poverty in Mexico. In Guatemala. The ethnic groups are mestizos, and there's over 23 languages. Some of the ones I'm going to talk about: Quiché, Cachiquel, Mam, Quechua, and other Mayan languages. So here's a nice language map. Spanish is spoken by 60% of the people, and the Mayan languages by 40%. Many of the children are still speaking their Mayan languages, their native languages, in the homes as they grow up. And as far as my work in Chiapas with the native languages, I see a lot more the native languages in the schools in Mexico than I do in Guatemala. Not many materials published in their native languages. Religions, 68 are Catholic, 25% are Protestant, and 7% practice our indigenous Mayan beliefs. And when it's more complicated than that because there's a lot of people who practice both the Catholic religion and their indigenous beliefs. And the Catholic Church has been supportive of that. So the most recent events in Guatemala that are really important is the trial for genocide and crimes against humanity. I remember 2 years ago hearing that the former General Rios Montt would finally be being brought to trial. I remember I was walking down by the cruise ship's docks in Juneau's when I heard the news, and I was very excited. And yet the trial has been delayed, and I'll tell you a little more about the recent trial, which was supposed to be taking place in January, was again delayed. So even in Spain, I think it was in Spain at the time, this was brought up in 2001, and it's continuing to be delayed. So here's the timeline for the Civil War. I'll give you a few of the important dates. Is this one still working good? Okay. Okay, so in 1954, the CIA supported a military leader in a coup to overthrow their democratically elected leader. And they were also, the leader at the time was trying to nationalize the United Fruit Company. And something that was happening about the same time and into the 60s was liberation theology was moving through Central America. So the churches, the priests and the churches, were changing the way that they saw the economic disparity in their parishes and in their country. And the indigenous people at the same time were also realizing that they had a voice and that they had control over their own lives. And so that led to them organizing. They were very, very exploited on all the fruit plantations and coffee plantations, and they began to organize. You know, many of these workers, they would have to leave their home. They would only have a small plot of land where they grew vegetables and beans for their family, and they would have to leave that area and go work on the plantations. So the best land was taken over. So when they began to organize in the 60s is when the Civil War started. And when I was there, I always wondered, what are all these people doing with machine guns, all over? Where's the war? And it's against their own people. So that was the beginning of the 36-year Civil War, and began with campesinos organizing. So then in '66, there was finally a democratically elected president, so civilian rule was restored. And then in 1970, another military-backed president was elected. So we're seeing the majority of these are military, like former generals becoming president, or backed by the military throughout this entire time. And then the one I mentioned earlier was the former General Rios Montt, and he was a military leader, and he was the one known for the scorched earth policy. So he was both as a general and then as the president, he was responsible for a lot of the crimes. He was the architect of the scorched earth policy, and literally was scorched earth. When I was there in the 80s, I was first of all studying Spanish in Quetzaltenango, and then traveling and doing volunteer work in the countryside. And as I would travel, let's say from Quetzaltenango to the Naba region or the Ixil region, I would see areas where villages once stood and they were completely burned out. There were just black scars on the side of the mountains. And sometimes you would see white crosses. Some of the people who survived and fled these villages went to a government area which were called Polos de Desarrollo, or development poles. And there were very regimented areas, just shacks like in rows, very different from their indigenous villages and the style of life that they originally had with their culture. It seemed like their culture was totally devoid in these areas. And then others fled to the mountains, and we will talk about that. They fled to the mountains and they hid out in the mountains for like 20 years and in the jungle. So here's a picture of Rios Montt. I have a larger picture of this too. So here he is on stage with the, and here's another larger picture of him. He's the one in the middle. So with the president and the former general. Okay, so I'm going to be highlighting, that picture was taken by Jonathan Moeller. I'm going to highlight some of the photography work of Jonathan Moeller. Jonathan Moeller and a friend of mine from college were both working as accompaniers. So as people lived in the villages, others would come, different parts of the world, and they would accompany the campesinos who were hiding out in the jungle. And so he began doing that work, and then also bringing supplies, like United Nations would send supplies, and they would bring supplies down to these. There were refugees within their own country. And he also began doing photography at the time, and documenting exhumations of clandestine cemeteries, which we'll talk about. And this is where will be the photographs that I mentioned. So during the time of genocide, you can see, I'm starting out with this photo because you can see these are women from Theyba. I was in the region of Theyba, and it's a very, very strong, rich cultural area. And when I was there, it was just an incredible feeling of both the landscape and the culture and the people being just very beautiful, and yet they suffered so much in the atrocities. So I wanted to start out with this picture to show the rich part of their cultures, their ceremonies, flowers, and their costumes. And here are caskets. So after the Civil War had passed, they were able to get the remains and do a memorial. Here's an example of a woman holding a picture of her husband who was 50 when he was murdered. And she's at one of the memorial services. So these pictures were taken in about the year 2000, so approximately 20 years after the massacres. Here's a picture of Nicolas. You'll see some of these are numbered. This is part of a traveling exhibit. If people are interested in, I'll talk about that traveling exhibit later. It's possible, even maybe somebody in the viewing audience across the state, if they're interested in the traveling exhibit. So there's, just to match up with the photo and the captions, I've kept the numbers on most of the pictures. And so here's Nicolas. He's a Mayan priest, and he's holding a cross with the names of 7 of his relatives who were murdered. The youngest one was 7 months old. And this is in the communities of popular resistance, and the acronym is CPR. And that's in the Sierra, the region I pointed out, in the north of Guatemala that borders Chiapas. And here's another exhumation of graves, and the grieving people are around it. So some of the people died due to the army or the paramilitary patrollers, and others died of hunger or illness as they were hiding out in the jungles. And I wanted to mention, too, at this time, when people were hiding out in the jungles, there was very little food. So, yeah, people did die of hunger. The first thing when they came to an area they felt was safe from the army, is they would dig a trench to hide in case they were attacked again. And then they would build a room to live in. And for years, one of the games that children would play is when they were playing in the dirt, is they would like pretend to dig these trenches by maybe their house. And you know, when it came time to play, like what the people were going to do, they were play and say they were going to hide in their trenches. So it really has affected the children with the trauma and the violence that they lived through. Here's a picture of the Guatemalan army. This is 6 months before the peace accords were signed, and they're promenading in front of the National Palace. Another picture here, this one in color, you can see their colorful costumes. So there's finally have time to grieve in public for their loved ones that they lost during the war. And these coffins carrying the remains of the victims from the massacres. So Jonathan Moeller was involved in some of the forensic work just by taking pictures and documenting. So he put these into a book, and then later another book for educators, so that he could keep the memory of help keep the memory of the atrocities that happened alive. Okay, so the next photo shows the remains of 2 women, a man, and a child. They were part of a mass grave with 25 people, and it was near the village of San Francisco, which is in Theyba. And I spent some time in Theyba, very beautiful area, and I was there like a year or 2 after these events happened. So I saw a lot of fear, a lot of trauma in that area. And it was not really easy traveling. In spite of the fact that it was like hauntingly beautiful, it was not an easy area to travel in. So here's a picture of the grave. And you can see in this picture here, the Guatemalan women, as you saw in the earlier pictures, they wear their woven textiles around their head, and a lot of them have pom-poms on, and you can see that in that one photo. So that's their traditional indigenous culture. So which, you know, when you think about just the amount, there's over 200,000 people who were murdered, and the majority were indigenous people. And here's some more of the graves. So this is the book that I mentioned that Jonathan Moeller has published, and it's called Our Culture is Our Resistance, and it's Repression, Refuge, and Healing in Guatemala. So then finally, in 1996, the peace accords were signed under President Alvaro Arzu, and people were very glad to be ending their 36-year conflict. And yet in the aftermath and the lack of security, there's still a lot of fear. There's not a really strong police force, either for financial or on just lack of motivation, you know, to bring in a whole new system of keeping the security in their country. And so now in the aftermath, as I mentioned, here's a picture of Rios Montt at this one was in March 2012 in court, and he's talking there with his lawyers. Now, in 2015, which was just January, while I was there, Jonas and other friends of mine were at the trial. I was working in another part of Guatemala. I was unable to be there. Rios Montt was now unable to attend the trial due to health. His lawyer said he would not be there, but the judge, she insisted that he attend the trial, and so they sent an ambulance through the streets of Guatemala City and loaded him on a stretcher and brought him into this tribunal. This is the tribunal, the day of the trial in Guatemala City in January. And here again, same building with the people who are family members of the survivors. They've put out pictures of their loved ones who they've lost. And one of the mottos or the sayings is people keep saying, sí, hubo genocidio, which means yes, there was genocide. Because a lot of times people are trying to even repress the memory of the genocide. So in the aftermath of all of the violence that took place, it's the women who have suffered the most due to the genocide. There's been this legacy of brutality. There's been a lack of accountability within the police force. And so women just are not protected. And indigenous women in the countryside especially have the worst of it. And so a lot of times when women do report, they become victimized again. They're made to seem like the victim. So one of the projects that I'm aware that's going on in Guatemala that is working toward changing this, there's an organization called Safe Passages, and they work with women who, they're mostly single mothers who are living in the garbage dumps trying to support their families, and there's an organization called Safe Passages which is helping them. And Roberta Wall from the Center of Nonviolent Communication, and we do have a group here in Juneau that's trained in by the Center for Nonviolent Communication. Well, Roberta's one of the trainers both nationally and internationally. She went down to Guatemala. I was able to attend one of her trainings, and she helps in a way, especially it's really good for these NGOs, the non-governmental organizations who are working with like the poorest of the poor and working with the aftermath of the conflict and the violence. And she's training them in the nonviolent communication. So it's opening up, especially in a staff like this, you can imagine the amount of stress that they have in working with their constituents, just like anyone working with families victims of domestic violence. So they're learning how to open up difficult conversations, visioning their next steps, and keeping their organization in line with their missions, with their organization's mission. And so here's a picture of the training, very interactive. And so she gave this training to the staff and the constituents of Safe Passages in Guatemala City. And I attended a training by her too, and it was just prior to this training. And here's another one. And this, as I mentioned, Safe Passages works mostly with single mothers and who are living and working in the shadows of Guatemala City's garbage dumps. Huge city, a lot of poverty, and a lot of crime. It's just a horrendous situation. And so she's helping groups that are working with them be effective. And so the basis of nonviolent communication is everyone's going to communicate their needs and look at the strategies that they're using to meet these needs. So in Guatemala City, as I mentioned, or just throughout Guatemala, women are afraid to report abuse by a spouse because the perpetrators are rarely punished and it can be turned around against them. So first, they're not believed. Second, they're penalized and they're taken as responsible for the cases. And I've seen this to be true of the cases of some of the families I worked with. So I do want to mention one more thing about women's rights and violence against women is human trafficking. And I did work with a family who's victims of human trafficking, and this is very true that they're victimized again. And Guatemala is a country of destination, of origin, and transport for human trafficking. And it's a very, very difficult situation. Both drug trafficking and human trafficking are two of the largest sources of income, illegal income. And so it's very strong in Guatemala, and it's very tragic. Okay, so I'm going to show two places that I worked with the communities, again, working to support people and looking at organizations and what's positive in the future. So I mentioned before that when the indigenous people had to flee from their homes and their villages, their traditional villages, to seek safety, they went in the jungle and they hid. Well, after the peace accords, they finally decided they could come out to the clearing or come out to the claro, and they formed villages, and these were called CPRs, Comunidades de Población en Resistencia. And the English translation would be Popular Communities of Resistance. So here's a picture of me in front of the house where I stayed, and then some children I met on a walk. Some of the houses, this guy's fixing his steel chainsaw there, and some coffee that's drying. So life is very peaceful here. Notice there's like 3 or 4 instead of being in their traditional villages where just one language is spoken, people have formed new villages further north in the jungle, and there's like 2 or 3 or 4 languages spoken by different families. So this is a friend of mine, Rosa, and she's right by her cacao tree. There's unripe cacao there, and there's a ripe one there, the yellow, and she's drying cacao. And that's one of the products that they grow and they market. Cardamom is another one. I'm just going to go through these really quick. Some children, one of the books I gave them. This is the place I stayed. This is one of Jonathan's photos again, and not much materials. So here they're using kind of a Paulo Freire education system. They're narrating their lives and then reading it back. So this is, they say we have good food. We must have good food in order to grow so that our family is healthy. And they're talking just about the importance of food. And so that's what they're reading. There's children. I happened to be walking right before the sun was setting. I wanted to get in a walk at the end of the day. The moon was rising. And then these children just were really lively and talking and smiling and laughing, so I had a fun time with them. This is another village. This is where I'm organizing an education program. While I was down there, I was translating for some of the beginning stages of the work, and we're looking to provide education for children and meaningful work for women. So I worked with Silvio for 2 weeks in organic gardening, and also did the translating at the same time. Visited his house. His sisters are making jewelry for to sell to tourists. And at least, hey, they've got good, safe work in a safe house. There's the mom, and I think there's like about 8 children. But then I thought, wow, they're children, and they have to work and make their living. Here's a picture of me with the youngest brother. And this is their school. They have no place for the kids to play. This is on Lago Atitlan. It's the only village. It's an indigenous village, and it doesn't have any connection with tourism, so they have no other source of income except agriculture and, well, the jewelry they were making. And the lake is rising, and so everything, because of the volcanoes around the lake, it's often steep. You have the lake, and then it's steep. And so they want to build a retaining wall here so that the children have a place to play in front of the school. Religious freedom. And people in this village have a lot of knowledge of their traditional ways, and yet I've talked to them and they say they cannot, like, for example, do ceremonies. They're afraid of repression. They can't do Mayan ceremonies and Mayan spiritual practices. Some people do, and it's sanctioned by the government, and the tourists come and they pay for these ceremonies. So there's certain ones that are sanctioned, but overall as a community and an individual, they don't feel they have that freedom. And from the people I talked to in this village, they said, if the government approves, and some of the, like the Mayan priests or shamans are able to travel, and there are ones that travel in different countries, Canada and Europe, performing Mayan ceremonies. So there's a picture of Silvio again. They let because I was looking at the organization to help out with the school. This was winter break, because they have winter break in December, January. They have a shorter summer break. Their main break is at Christmas time. So his dad, who's on the school board, he let us into the school. And he was raised with a lot of the traditional beliefs of his grandparents, knew a lot of the Mayan ways. So when I was working in the garden, I would often ask a question or say something, and he would say things like, well, the rocks are related to the soil. The rocks are brothers of the soil. And bringing in just a whole Mayan worldview to their work and to their land. That's it. Thank you very much. Any questions?
Maria, on your latest visit, did you get exposed or hear much about the continuing influence of the Maras?
Of the
Mara 18, the gangs.
Oh, yes. I haven't researched that much, and I did not spend much time in Guatemala City. I'm pretty highly sensitive to a lot of the atrocities, and plus I was there in the 80s, just kind of worried about safety. I didn't spend a lot of time in Guatemala City. But they're spreading out of Guatemala City into Antigua, which is a really touristed area, and even small businesses. And I think especially, again, here's where the single moms, women are just trying to start up a little business, and the gangs go around to all of them and make them pay a certain amount of money so that they're protected. And so really they're living in fear. Sometimes there's so much competition, there's a lot of thievery, their things are stolen, and then they have the gangs asking for more money. And don't know a whole lot more on that, but I'm not an expert on that topic.
What's been your experience getting in and out of the country over the years, 80s versus now? Have you ever been refused entry?
No, I traveled overland mostly.
From Mexico?
Yes. And I flew once between Guatemala City and Nicaragua. Never had any problems. Never been refused entry. The airport in Guatemala City, it's a little sketchy. You have to be very careful, and you just have to have your wits about you all the time. I was bringing in a little bit more than I usually travel with, which, flying into Guatemala City is, I don't want to be on the buses at the borders. Had donations with me, so I flew right into the city. Luckily, I had a friend picking me up at the airport, and there's everyone, jostling, to try to get the person with money, or maybe either, it just seems kind of dangerous, or they're going to try to, there might be somebody who tries to steal your belongings. So moved right from getting out of that door in the airport, stuff in the car, and driving out of the area.
Are you working with your own NGO or with a bunch of them, or?
Right now I'm working with a group of people, but it's not an NGO. It's we're not at that point yet. So just looking at supporting the education of the children in Chacaya. Yes.
And I'm kind of aware of the domestic violence topic you brought up, and I'm curious about more detail about the level of addressing domestic violence. Is it still pretty much at that phase of building social awareness, or is there efforts to get court access to some of the more rural areas, or?
Yeah, it says, you might have read it on the slide, I didn't mention it, Guatemala is like one of the worst countries for women to live. They're under the most threat of danger of anywhere in the world. They're really marginalized. It's definitely would have had to be addressed on all levels. Security, police has to be increased, and then people's awareness and attitudes. And then, probably training on all sides. Roberta Wall, who I mentioned, and you were asking me of organizations I worked with. I'm still working with Roberta Wall. I'm in communication. We have long-term plans that she would come back to Guatemala. I'm hoping to, and that's part of, it would be part of the NGO or 501c3, I'm sure, Center for Nonviolent Communication. They are a nonprofit. They have nonprofit status. And I'm looking to work together with her to bring her back in, along with probably 3 other trainers, and do a 9-day training. She's in the Middle East right now. She just completed a 9-day training, which is a very intensive training for nonviolent communication. And she's worked in Gaza and Palestine. And so to bring that kind of training back to Guatemala would help the women and just many, many ways. Yes.
I don't mean to oversimplify, but humanity's general problem is that there are too many of us trying to live in too small a space. Is this prevailing in Guatemala? Are there just too many people for the resources available?
I think, yeah, that's an issue everywhere. Latin America, it's very true. So Latin America, and let's say for Guatemala right now, we have the overpopulation. The Catholic Church for a long time was very supportive of big families, and then the land, so as land gets divided between more and more people. And then on top of that, you have the best land was taken to grow coffee and for, let's say, United Fruit historically, other types of plantations. When I was coming back from Tikal, I saw acres and acres of palm oil being grown. And so that's the best land. All the flat land is being used for these crops, export crops. So very, very important topic.
Thank you for your information. Can you tell us about Rigoberta Menchú?
Well, she's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. She has an organization with the money from her, the Peace Prize. She started a nonprofit and she works with children there. I use her books that she's written in my curriculum. I have both books in Spanish and English. And I'm not up on any details of what the work she's doing now is. But
Thank you.
She's written books for children too, and there's books written about her.
Could you address the influence of the gangs in Guatemala and what the government is doing to address that and deal with it?
I don't know what the government is doing at all. And the family I was working with outside of Antigua, where I said they've not only come to Antigua, but all the villages outside of it, there's a church group where people are getting together to kind of stand up against the gangs. So they're trying to address it on a local level. Because there's very little public enforcement of criminal activity, people take things into their own hands, and this can be good and bad. And one of the things that happens in Guatemala is lynching. So if somebody commits a crime, the community gets together and they lynch. It can be very dangerous because there's no due process, no legal system. They don't have any recourse. They could be guilty or innocent, but if the community or a group of people believe that, and sometimes they're just thrown in jail. But then as far as the gangs, I haven't heard of the government taking any steps on that. Again, I haven't researched it, but I will now.
Thank you, Maria, for your presentation. And your work is significantly focused on the children, is what I'm understanding, especially with languages. And so is there a limit as to what can be brought in, what's being taught, or if you were able to acquire a grant to start looking at putting language books in their indigenous languages, would there be restrictions on what the material actually is, such as coloring books? That may be traditional or other things? I mean,
I have not heard of any restrictions. There's a lot of NGOs who've started their own education programs, and they are able to do as much as they want, as much as they can fund. I haven't heard of any restrictions of the government. They don't seem too interested in controlling, or don't have the infrastructure to control it. So education is supposedly free, but families have to pay for uniforms and books, and many families just can't afford it. So some people are just paying for the kids so that they have the books. The programs you might be aware of where you sponsor a child and it helps pay for their schooling. They may be living with their families, but they need help with education.
My question came because you were talking about the limitation of the religious practices, too. I was thinking about in ways that it could be stimulated by creating, language books. And
Right.
would that become an issue, or is that a way to go about it? I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't heard of any, problems with that. But there is, if you promote the native culture and you promote the native languages, then, the government could be afraid of that again as people. They don't want to have power, getting too much power. But I haven't seen, as of yet, I haven't seen any repression on that. But when you look at there's a Indigenous, or the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights, Indigenous people have a right for educational materials in their Indigenous language and to be educated in their Indigenous languages. And I don't see any of those rights being afforded to the Indigenous communities in Guatemala. Mexico has a much larger, stronger movement to sustain the Indigenous languages.
I was just going to ask about that. What is the difference between how the indigenous people fare in southern Mexico versus Guatemala?
Southern Mexico is really different. About 20 years ago, there was the Zapatista uprising. They formed autonomous regions. The autonomous regions have a lot of international donation money coming in. They have beautiful schools, lots of books, lots of materials in their indigenous languages. Other areas are autonomous but don't have the support of the Zapatistas. And they're still speaking their native languages, but they don't have the material for their curriculum. Now, so Chiapas especially has set, it's just one state in Mexico, but they really set the precedence. So the government, not wanting that movement to grow any bigger than it is, starts funding bilingual education through their state-supported schools. Because now they're paying families to send their kids to school so that these people, and there might be some contingencies, because I've seen people lined up to get their money, and there might be contingencies that they're not part of the Zapatista movement in order to get their money. And they're sending their kids, so they don't want them to have that indigenous education through these autonomous, they're completely autonomous communities that don't receive government money. So they've had the same thing going on with, liberation theology first came through, trade union, farm, campesino organizations organizing. They were squashed by paramilitaries, but then there was this other infrastructure. Guatemala, too, had some very good organizations, but not to the level that Mexico did. They had different organizations that really did work together. But because of, Mexico has a lot more infrastructure too. They're able to they have the funding to support, to build their own bilingual schools. I've seen a lot of bilingual education in Chiapas.
Would you say more about land use? You talked about the best land, the flattest land, being primarily palm oil plantations. Who owns that land? How did they get it? Is there a possibility that the people will take it back? And how would that happen?
Those are good questions. That'll take a long time. I don't have an answer to that, but I do remember hearing as I drove through the acres and acres and thousands of acres of palm oil, who owned it, and some discussion on that, and I don't remember the details of it right now. And there's not a big movement for land reform right now that I'm aware of. But I think that's definitely would be on the agenda for real change to take place. And the second issue would be education, land reform and education.
Have you seen any change in the role of the Catholic Church over the years, particularly in the last few?
No, I'm not really aware. I've seen a big difference between the evangelical churches and the Catholic Church. And the evangelical churches seem to have a little more intolerance for people participating in their traditional indigenous cultures, especially their Mayan spiritual beliefs. And the Catholic Church is more tolerant of it.
Were you in the north part of the country, fairly close to the Mexico border?
Yes, I was, back in the 80s, and I think maybe one trip in the 90s, and then recently, yes. The last slides I showed, well, there was the one on Lake Atitlán, but the ones prior to that where I said community of popular resistance, that was near the Chiapas border.
What's the border like? Is it quite porous? The border between
Forest?
The border,
Yeah.
but porous between the two countries, Mexico and Guatemala.
Porous?
Easily ignored.
Yeah. Yes and no. It's a little tenuous, but it's pretty wild. There's a few roads that go, and the river, the Usumacinta River. So yeah, people can cross it without being detected, but it's not exactly the safest place either. I took a boat from all the way down from Rio Pasión to the Usumacinta and into Mexico in the, I think, early 90s, and had no problem, but I was a little nervous at times. Just crossing the border, it was just one military outpost, and that was it. Just made me think, this is an area I have to be very careful. Yeah.
These villages, in terms of ownership, can people probably be pushed out real fast if someone with a little power decides he wants that chunk of land, and that then leads somewhat to whether or not they can retain relatively fertile land over the course of time, and that has a lot to do with emotional stability and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, I have a sense that things can change at any moment, but right now all the communities of resistance, the CPRs, seem to have a pretty good stronghold and ability. For example, they're exporting cardamom without a middleman, and so and that's where they're making good money, and there's a lot of good economic development going on in many of the areas. So right now things are going well, but it's important questions, and I would encourage anyone who had the opportunity to go to Guatemala or support any organizations, research the issues you brought up, for example, on gangs and land reform. I don't have the answers, but I support all of you to look more into it and support any efforts and go down there. Okay, I think I have time for one more question. I would say Guatemala, it's very worthwhile to learn Spanish or to go down there, and it's safe. Just, I think it's very important to be careful. And thank you all for coming.
That was Maria Offer discussing human rights in Guatemala in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded March 9, 2015 at 360 in Juneau. With support from GCI, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Wastman & Associates Incorporated, Coeur Alaska Incorporated, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Sea Alaska, and Alaska Power and Telephone.